Great. Emily, take it away. You are welcome to share your screen if you'd like as well.
Excellent.
Looks good.
Let's see. Okay, excellent. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Yep. Okay. So since like we said, my goal today is just to go over like a brief introduction to a bit of some of the decision support tools, but more specifically how we're going to be using them for the Charette at the conference later this month. And I know that we don't have a lot of time today, just like about a half an hour. And so we'll be going through this quite quickly, but more than happy to follow up with any questions and following the presentation. So the goal of the workshop is to introduce participants to some of the decision support tools that we developed as part of this bigger Dam Atlas project, which some of you might be, I think, are familiar with. Really, the idea is that there's many ways that we go about facilitating conversations about dams. This is just one method that we've developed and that are excited to share. But of course, you all probably have other methods. The goal is just to begin a process of exchanging ideas of how we all have gone about engaging communities in these conversations, and just to kind of build a library of approaches that we could all share. And so this is, I'll be sharing this for this workshop, but hopefully in the future you all will also share and we could have more of a conversation about some of the different techniques we've used. So the materials we developed are essentially bring together two methods. One is the community engagement methods from the design charrettes, along with structured decision-making. And so structured decision-making is a process whereby community members and stakeholders are brought into a process of making a decision. And these are some basic steps that are frequently used in a structured decision-making process. The first is framing the problem. What is within the context of a dam? That would be, what is the scope of what we're looking at? Is it a single dam or a whole river? The next step would be determining objectives. How are we going to be able to evaluate the alternatives and whether or not they are reaching our objectives, which is our long-term kind of goals of a project. The next step is identifying alternatives. What are the possible strategies that could be considered? The fourth is estimating the consequences. So if we choose these different alternatives, how they impact our objectives. And then evaluating those trade-offs, and then finally deciding and taking action. And so, we could talk about and think about this as a linear process, but really, as we all know from working on many projects, often it's much more cyclical. You'll go through the process and then you'll realize, oh, there's new alternatives that we need to consider, or, oh, there's new objectives that are now on the table. So, but this is just kind of a big picture, kind of structured decision-making, the various steps. And I think what's important and what we've developed, and that this is probably something that you all are familiar with from your work, the underlying kind of ethics of the work that we're doing, and that I think is important to understand as you're facilitating during the workshop, is that really there are some key things that we learned from running this process, and that I think is just helpful to share. So the first is obviously respecting local people's values and perspectives. So just being willing to acknowledge and honor and make space for a conversation about all the various issues that come up during a dam discussion. The idea of there being neutral facilitators and structured dialogue. Really this, and this is something that was brought up by Allison kind of leading up to the conversation today, but the idea of not to go into a community with a set agenda, but to bring stakeholders in the community in so that there's a creative process of exploring alternatives together. The third is helping participants shift from positions to interest. This is a really important part of the methods that we developed. Positions are something that participants have already decided upon, whereas interests are what caused them to make that decision. So for example, a position would be remove the dam or keep the dam, whereas an interest would be improve fish passage or maintain historic character of the town or something like that. So just our goal is to have conversations about interests, because then we can find places of negotiation and of compromise. Exploring a range of alternatives to move past binary positions. So, methods we developed are largely for the small dams. that are here in New England, where there's often a range of alternatives that exist beyond just solely keeping or removing. And by opening up a conversation about various alternatives and thinking about it creatively, there can be also that space of negotiation. One of the other goals is fostering learning by making information accessible and visual. So you'll see that we use a lot of visual tools, materials that people can hold as a way of making a lot of what can be very quantitative information about these projects more accessible. And then the last part is just transparent evaluation of alternatives based on objectives. So the idea of like, how do we, as we keep in mind all these various alternatives and all the different goals of a project, how can we make our decisions transparent to one another so that we can understand what are the different factors that are leading to people making decisions. So we developed a whole range of actual materials that we have been using and testing on various projects. And also methods for how we use them. And so this is being put together as part of this larger publication, the DAM Atlas, but we'll be doing kind of an experiment with this for the workshop in October that we're organizing. So the idea is that there's going to be in the room for the afternoon part of this, we'll have a screen in the front, and then we'll have different tables set up. The red dot are the facilitators, you all, and then the green dots will be the participants. I think Steph said there might be a bit more at each table, so maybe anywhere from like 8 to 10 people at each table. But the idea being that we are breaking the larger group up into smaller tables so that we could have more intimate conversations and make sure that everybody has a chance to participate. The overall plan for the workshop is that we are going to do an introduction where we describe the scenario to the participants. We're going to hand out role-playing cards that everybody gets to like read through their role and understand and get into character, put on their character hats. We then will go through a process of everybody at the table introducing themselves to each other. And we'll be using what I call kind of trade-off cards or interest cards, which you'll see later on an example of, but really trying to get participants to talk about, you know, the issues that are important to them from the point of view of their own interests, and also just as a way of getting familiar with each other at the table. We then would go back to the larger group in order to talk about case studies, alternatives. Then at the individual tables, there'll be discussions of alternatives. Then we'll go back, talk about matrix. We'll then rank the alternatives, and then we'll go to the conclusion. So I'll walk through all this in a little bit slower detailed so you get a sense of it. But just so you know, this is the kind of the general structure of what the afternoon will look like. And so even before we get into this part, which is the like, we're in our roles, we're doing all the kind of, you know, the role playing. Before this, I'm going to give an overall like intro to the DAM Atlas and the methods, and then we're going to start the charrette. What I have circled here in yellow are the things that I will be leading up at the front. What I have circled here in kind of this tealish color is what you all will be doing at the individual tables. And so the scenarios, we're still working through this, and Steph and I are working on a Google Doc that we're writing out the different scenarios. Would absolutely love it if any of you want to chime in, or I'm happy to share the document if you want to kind of add anything or make any comments. But we are kind of considering right now whether to do one scenario or two scenarios. But essentially, one scenario, we're looking essentially at a hydropower dam, looking at issues of fish passage, impoundment. So trying to make these somewhat realistic from the point of view of these kind of complex dam issues that we often are confronted with. And then the other one we were considering is more of like a historic dam. It's kind of legacy, no longer serves a purpose, but it's really important to the community from a, you know, like a sense of place point of view. And so these are the two scenarios that we're playing around with. And I think we might just go with one of them. We might go two. It kind of depends on space and different kind of possibilities in terms of how we structure it. But either way, the structure for the overall workshop would be the same, that there'd be a person introducing the scenario at the front, and then the individual discussions taking place at the table. So we'd introduce the scenario, and then everybody would get their bios or their role-playing kind of cards. And the cards will, you know, just be, you know, kind of a range of people who, you know, from kind of stakeholders and town reps, federal reps, to just local residents. So trying to get the kind of a wide range of people who might be present, right, during a conversation of the future of a dam. And so on each of the cards, there'll be, you know, some details. There might be some personality things that could just, you know, kind of help people get into character, as well as a listing of what the key project objectives are that they're really interested in, so that they're kind of able to advocate for that as they go forward in their role. So down here on the lower left is some of the different characters or the different roles that we've been brainstorming about right now. So upstream property owner, downstream property owner, NOAA or town rep, watershed association, a state rep, historic preservation officer, paddler, fisher person, citizen-led environmental group. So just kind of really trying to get a range of participants or range of different roles that people will step into that are kind of approaching the issue from different angles. So the first part will be, you know, everybody in this first, they read their bio, and then we do a round of group introductions. The idea for the group introductions is that people would use what we call these interest cards. So this is a way of really early on in a public process of prompting people to talk about the issues from the point of view of their interest rather than the point of view of their positions, right? So if you remember back, that's one of our goals here, is to shift these conversations a little bit. So we'll have printed out these cards that are physical cards that will be in the middle of a table, and then participants will choose a couple of them in order to introduce themselves. And this is a way of having a structured way to go around for introductions. It's also a way for people to move back past singular issues that they're caught up on. It's like, you know, you have to choose 3 to 5 cards, you know, we'll have that clearly written out in the instructions for you all. Okay, have everybody choose 5 cards to introduce themselves. And it also, you know, just is a way that, you know, just like I said, it just helps to have everybody be able to introduce themselves in a structured way. So that'll go, you know, so we'll do at your individual tables, you'll go around and everybody will just introduce themselves. And that'll be kind of that first small group discussion. And there's an example at a public meeting where I was using these cards in this way. The next step is to kind of, you know, we're in a room where hopefully we could then easily turn back to the front. And I will kind of at the front just go over some of the case studies as a way of introducing participants to how other sites have addressed these issues in the past. And so we will talk through a couple of different possible alternatives for the different dam scenarios, you know, everything from, you know, removal to technical fish ladders to truck and haul to bypass channels. And so we will have, I'll do like an overview of that kind of introduction at the front, as well as an introduction of different possible case studies, right? That just are like, hey, you know, here's some examples of how different communities looking at similar issues have approached this, right? And so the idea is that it begins to help people develop an imagination, their own imaginations of possible other future conditions, right? By looking at some of these case studies. So that'll be up at the front, just kind of an overview. And then going back to the small groups, right? The idea is that it alternates between this as a way of providing an overview to everybody, but then having smaller group discussions where people feel more comfortable having these you know, having discussions. So at that point, there could be kind of discussion of the different alternatives that have been presented. You know, maybe I'm still debating if we'll actually have like an aerial of a, you know, a site that is generalized and just that's available for people to like brainstorm on, like what are alternatives that haven't been considered. You know, is there something that we haven't included in alternatives that might be useful for, or might be a possibility? And then we will, you kind of at the individual tables, there'll be more of a kind of like brainstorming session of like a discussion of like, well, what are the different thoughts about the different alternatives? What are the different thoughts about how the different materials presented about the case studies align with the issues at this dam? You know, so there'll be like more of a kind of open discussion that that'll take place at the tables. Here's just some examples from Charettes that I've run where the idea is to have it be interactive, to have it be creative, to have it be a brainstorming, right? A kind of like, what are some of the possibilities? What are the pros and cons, and an open discussion. Following that, kind of come back to the front and present the matrix. The matrix is essentially where we can begin to evaluate how well the different alternatives, which are listed up here at the top, align with the different project objectives, right? So what we can see here are, kind of some generalized alternatives up at the top. And on the left here, we have, ecological trade-offs, cultural aesthetic trade-offs. I might include infrastructural trade-offs in the final draft of this, maybe economic trade-offs. But as you can see, a lot of this is pretty general, but just as a way of helping people understand how this matrix works in an actual decision-making process around a dam. What I've done for projects is that I run this public process alongside an H&H study or other studies so that you could actually have quantifiable data in this. Obviously, this is a hypothetical project, so we won't be doing that. But the idea is that we can kind of introduce people, right, to the use of a matrix as a way of being able to clearly and transparently evaluate, right, the different objectives and alternatives.
Emily, can I just butt in for 1 second? So just as a reminder that, like you said, in the real process, we would be kind of filling this in and figuring it all out. But in this process, this will be filled out for you. We'll be reviewing it. So you don't have to have participants figure out like, what are the differences between all of these? You'll just get this and we'll kind of jump ahead and say, all right, we already figured this out. We're going to assume now we have these different options to move forward considering.
And the way that we use this matrix is that it's also a way of getting people to think beyond like a single position, like I'm here because I want to remove the dam, right? Or I'm here because I want to keep the dam. So these matrices go along with like, those little red, yellow, and green dots that we sometimes use during workshops. So there's a photo of one later on, but anyways, everybody at the table you guys will have a stack of these dots. And as part of that process, we ask people to use the green stickers to indicate preference, the yellow stickers to indicate an acceptable alternative, and a red sticker to indicate an alternative that they're opposed to. And everybody's required to use at least one green and at least one yellow sticker on their own, right? So everybody will have this sheet of paper printed out in front of them, and they'll be using those dots in order to indicate their preference, right? And so what you'll see about this process is that we're not looking for consensus. There's an understanding there won't be consensus, right? What we're looking for is a way that we can understand where people are at in terms of their preferences, and then be able to communicate that to the ultimate decision makers, right? So that's really kind of important in terms of understanding where and how this matrix fits into a larger decision-making process. So I'll go over that, and then you guys we'll go back to the tables. Here's an example of us using this for a project where the participants had that matrix in front of them. You could see these are the little dots that I mentioned, and then we asked people to use those dots, right, as a way of communicating and talking, and then having a discussion with each other, right? So what we did, how we do this is we ask people to use the dots to indicate, preferred, acceptable, and opposition to different alternatives, and then we go around the table and we share. And so that's that final step in the small groups, and then we will come back together for the conclusion at the end. And so that's like a whirlwind, as fast as I could possibly present on all this in a short period of time. In terms of our next steps, I know there's gonna be a lot of questions, and so I'm gonna stop in just a minute and open up to questions. But the next steps, by the end of this week, what I will do is I'm gonna share a draft of the Dam Atlas for you all. This is really for reference. We're still in the final stages of editing this document, so it's not intended to be shared widely, but I do want you all to have a chance to review it, just because it does talk through a lot of these steps and some kind of goes into a lot more detail about some of the reasons why we've developed these methods the way we have. We will also share with you the final scenarios and the roles. Like I said, I'm happy to share the Google Doc beforehand if anybody is interested in contributing to the process of drafting these into realistic scenarios. And then I will share with you all, facilitator, like the guide to the Charette workshop that'll walk you through step by step and provide you with prompts for discussion. So for example, during the discussion of alternatives, I'll have written out a couple of prompts that I will you can use or come up with your own prompts. And then lastly, just some general facilitator support and suggestions, which Steph mentioned that a lot of you already have experience with facilitating. So, but it'll just be kind of general, in terms of, how we create a space and deal with conflict and all these other things that sometimes come up during these kind of public processes. So with that, I know that was a lot and kind of a whirlwind introduction. So feel free to ask questions. And like I said, I will be sending along more detail, like step-by-step instructions and prompts. And also we could follow up with email if anything comes up between now and then.
And just as a reminder, day of, you'll have a printout of this stuff. So you'll know what you're doing and how much time we're kind of estimating it'll take you for each of those parts. And there'll be, I think I'm not a facilitator actually, so I'm just going to be a floater and kind of come around and help folks if they need it. So I know it seems like a lot, but I promise you it's not going to be a heavy lift.
And I'll also be there, and similar to Steph, I will probably not be facilitating my own group, but I will be there to kind of help at any moments and kind of guiding the whole process, right? So I'll be like, okay, now we're going to go into our small groups and introduce ourselves. And because I want the whole group to understand what we're doing. So I will, kind of be clear to everybody what the next step is and what the goal is and how long we have.
Any
I have
questions?
questions.
Oh, great.
I have one. For the group introductions for like the real life bigger picture goals of this event, which might be, networking among people. Do you want people to introduce themselves as their real selves as well as who they are, their role, or only their role?
My feeling about this, and Steph, you could say otherwise, my feeling is that hopefully everybody will have had a chance to kind of meet earlier in the day. And then my hope is that in this, just because we are going to be somewhat constrained in time, that people are like getting into their roles, maybe, but I don't know, Steph, what do you feel?
My instinct is to say, I'm Stephanie Carito, I'm from the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative, but today I'm playing this person. So that way you kind of have both. But this will be right after lunch. So I'm going to tell everybody before we break for lunch that people should sit with people they don't know, at least at the end of lunch, so that we can have, time to kind of maybe chit chat a little bit before we actually start on this. We'll see if people actually listen.
Okay. Yeah, I think at least your real name can be helpful to facilitate discussion and talking to each other. So
that's true. You can have a real name.
I've done this role playing a couple of times, and people get really into it. They like have their own names and like, yeah. Yes, Chris.
Thanks. Question on, it's like number 7. So the report out part, is that something that we as, we as facilitators are doing the report out, or is that something that we should like assign to somebody at the table? Or I'm sure you'll have more direction on that, but just curious.
Yeah, I think that's something, I don't know, we kind of go either way with that. Oftentimes I encourage people to have somebody at the table present out, during the conclusion. But sometimes you're with a group that's very shy and nobody wants to. And so as a facilitator, you do. So I'll have more specifics of that written out in the guide. But I would say if one of the participants is willing to share out, that could be great. Or it could also be that the facilitator tallies up the kind of final count of things. I haven't really thought through that conclusion yet for this specific workshop. So just so everybody knows, usually when I run these workshops, we don't do it as a single workshop. It's like 3 workshops over like 2 years. And so this is a really condensed version right now, just trying to introduce everybody to all the methods. And it's a workshop that could work, right, if you're just trying to do an exploratory workshop, but it's definitely not the kind of preferred period of time that you would obviously go through this process with a group. So I think in terms of I think in thinking about it, Chris, I think I might actually lean towards the facilitators reporting out for that, just as a way of summarizing kind of the different issues that came up, different topics, and then the kind of where people landed in terms of some of the different preferences.
Okay. And is everybody getting the same project? It sounded like it was, right? We're talking about the same project example that you're introducing. Did I understand that correct?
Well, Steph and I were going back and forth on this, and we had kind of thought through the possibility of either doing a single scenario in one room or having two rooms with two scenarios that are looking at two different kind of touchy issues that we deal with our dams around here. So either way, the structure will be the same. And I think we're still in kind of the final process of deciding whether it'll be a single or double scenario. What do you think, Steph?
I think the challenge of having two scenarios, I'm realizing, is because after every step we're going back to the big group, we can't have people go up and down the stairs that many times. So it might just be easier to all do work on one scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it'll be easier for sure
Yeah.
if we could just all stay in one room. I think if we were going to do two rooms, we would just have somebody in my role in that other room talking through, and that might be a little bit more tricky. So, but we could make that work. But either way, there'll be somebody at the front who's kind of coordinating and like the kind of guiding the whole process.
I know we're
Yes,
at
Allison.
30. I know Allison has to leave.
Thanks. Oh, yeah, quick question. So is the idea here to introduce this kind of charrette to the participants who may then take it back to their communities and use it on particular projects?
Absolutely.
And so what I'm wondering, what kind of support or whatever you may be able to offer to them if they like, oh, I really like this. I think we could do this, but it looks, it's going to take a lot of thinking through.
Yeah. So I didn't go over this at the beginning, but essentially what we're working on is we have a publication that'll be free and open source to download online. And then we also have a website that we are inching closer moment by moment to launching, that is also going to have all these materials downloadable for free for communities. And so essentially like trade-off cards, you could just download a PDF of them. The matrix, download a PDF of that. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to make the process really clear through instructions, and then make the actual materials available to easily download and with kind of software. Like I developed most of this stuff with InDesign, but I know that most people don't have InDesign. So I try to make it to where I then bring it over to a software that most people have access to, whether that's Word or some other software. And so, or Google Docs or something like that. So, so that's going to be the eventual kind of sharing of it all. But all of that will be, most of that should be up, and at least the platform will be shareable by the workshop that we do at the end of October. But it's still all in development, so it's kind of still in process, but excited to get to share this with, and hopefully, with the idea that, I'd love it if other community, other people who work on dams are interested in using it, and it doesn't have to be the whole process. It could just be the trade-off cards, like, hey, that worked really well, or it could be like, hey, the structured decision-making and matrix works really well, or anything. So the idea is just to introduce the whole process and then to let people choose if any of that makes sense for the different projects they're running.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry, I have to duck out and run another meeting, but this is very exciting. This looks so useful. So I'm really glad to be participating in it and really looking forward to it. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you. Excellent. I also have to jump off, unfortunately. I know that there might be other questions, but I have another call that I have to jump into, but this is like a big overview. Like I said, by the end of this week, I will follow up with much more kind of detailed step-by-step instructions. And so feel free, if there's any other questions that come up, to ask me or ask Steph. And then to, especially if after you read through the final materials at the end of this week, if you have any follow-up questions.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And I can stay on for a second if people have other questions, but I'll let Emily go.
Yeah, sorry to have to run everything.
Thank you.
I apologize, but thank you so much for being willing to facilitate and for, looking forward to meeting you all in person. I know I've seen many of you here in the Zoom world before, but it'll be great to get to work together in person on this. So, okay, I'm going to jump off. Sorry to have to run.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Hey, I'm just happy